Hello and welcome to the podcast. Let's get to know celebrating diversity at MIT. I'm your host, Neil Bardhan. I'm a postdoc in the lab of Professor Angela Belcher in the Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research. And this is the third episode. We are recording this on the 8th day of June in 2021. So before I introduce our guest for today, I'd like to make a few quick comments. So for those of you who are listening to this podcast, we also have a dedicated YouTube channel celebrating diversity. The link will be in the description, and I will also link the first two episodes down there. The first one featuring Ms. Uyanga Sedev, who is a recent alumnus of MIT's biological engineering and also an entrepreneur. And the second episode featuring Cameron Santana, who is a custodian in the Koch Institute. Also, leave a comment what you would like to ask our future guests on this podcast. And for those of you who are watching us, you may be wondering at this point in summer why we're still wearing masks. Well, that is to make sure we are in compliance with all of MIT's indoor mask requirements and policies, regardless of our vaccination status. So this podcast series is made possible by grant funding through MIT's Mind, Hand, Heart Innovation Fund. So a huge thank you to them for supporting this. And the goal of this podcast series is to invite KI community members from different cultural, national, ethnic backgrounds to share their personal experiences. And we hope to get to know each other better, get to know our cultures better, and broaden our perspective to promote diversity and inclusion in our community. And with that, without any further delay, I'm especially honored and delighted to introduce our guest for today. Please welcome Professor Dr. Matthew Vander Heiden, the newly appointed director of the Koch Institute for Cancer Research at MIT. Professor Vander Heiden, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today, and thank you for sharing your valuable time with us.
Sure. Well, and thank you for doing this podcast. It's really important for our community.
Thank you. And Professor, if I may, with all due respect, may I take the liberty of addressing you as Matt?
Of course. Yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. So with that, just to get the conversation started, Professor or Matt.
Matt, yeah, please call me Matt. I prefer Matt.
Thank you, Matt. Would you please tell us a little bit about the research that you do here in the Koch Institute? And just so, because we are talking to a broad audience here, maybe in somewhat of a layman language.
Sure, of course. Yeah, so you want me to talk about my laboratory's research or the research we do at the Koch Institute?
A little bit of both, preferably, given that you're now the leader of the KI.
Of course.
So your own personal research and how it fits into the broader theme of the Koch.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I'll start with the broader theme of the Koch because that feels most appropriate given my new role. And that is, the Koch Institute is the home for cancer research on the MIT campus. We've been an NCI designated basic cancer center dating back now many decades. The Koch Institute, in its current iteration, really was founded under the visionary leadership of my predecessor, Tyler Jacks, who, together with former MIT President Susan Hockfield, really tried to envision a different way to do cancer research where we could really take the best of MIT cancer science, which, is really the history of our cancer center here, and combine it with some of the increasingly interest that was coming from the engineering community at MIT. And the idea is that there could be this convergence of taking our basic understanding of cancer biology and combining that with a lot of the engineering talent at MIT and really try to come up with new solutions to cancer. And so individual labs like mine within the Koch Institute work on specific problems, either to try to better understand some aspect of cancer biology or to engage some new solution to help patients with cancer, either detect cancer earlier, prevent cancer, treat cancer better, etc. And it was really bringing those two things together, which is the vision of the Koch, because I think it's really great that increasingly the barriers between labs aren't as great as they were before. As you know, our labs worked closely together on some projects that would have seemed like science fiction to me before I came here. And just to tell you a little bit about my own laboratory's research, so, my lab was the first lab hired into the Koch Institute, and I was really excited in its new iteration, and I was really excited to come here because, I had a long-standing interest in understanding the metabolism of cancer. That is how cancer cells use nutrients in order to grow and divide, how that interfaces with tissues and the systemic effects of cancer on our bodies, how the food we eat influences whether cancers grow or not. And we really try to understand that from a quantitative biochemical perspective at the level of cells. And I was excited to come to the Koch because, what better place in the world to take quantitative science and really think about it in terms of, a problem like cancer. And I have to say, I've kind of lived the dream of the Koch Institute, right? We've had many great collaborations with, some of the engineering labs here in our institute that have really helped us approach and think about questions in very different ways. Happy to talk more about the Institute and our research, but I think we probably have other topics you want to cover today.
Well, along those lines, and thank you for sharing your personal story here with us, with the audience. Could you perhaps touch a little bit about your own career path and the kind of challenges that you had to face along the way?
Yeah, sure. There's lots of challenges that everyone has in any career path. And I guess, I'll start off by saying that, my career path is not typical for this, for our institute, only in that I really came to science through a very clinical, at least initially clinical path. So I am trained as a medical oncologist. I'm one of only a handful of practicing MDs, practicing clinicians, who are on the MIT faculty. And I'll just say something because it speaks a little bit about the personal decision to come to the Koch Institute. And that really starts with this notion. I remember when I was considering where to go for my faculty job, if I was lucky enough to be hired into one, and that really how I was thinking at the time. And a lot of people said, well, you have an MD PhD degree, you're a clinician, you should really be in a hospital. And I've been able to maintain my hospital appointment, and I'm very proud of that. I continue to see patients at Dana-Farber. But, I really was excited to come here because I figured someone who had clinical training, who sort of has access to people who are thinking about cancer on all these different levels, solving cancer problems, it felt to me like it would be a very exciting place and opportunity to be, because, I would bring this perspective of what really goes on in the hospital, which seems quite important to thinking about, let's make sure we're solving the right cancer problems, or thinking about the right questions to understand cancer that's really going to have the biggest impact. And so that sort of latter part of my career journey, I think, has really been framing for, I guess, what I've realized with my career. But just to take a step back and say how I got there, because certainly when I was, a high school student, I certainly wasn't thinking about this as a career. And if I'm honest, I'm not even sure I would have thought of this as a career that I realistically would be doing, even if I go to when I was starting medical school and my MD PhD degree. And so, I don't know how far back in background you want me to go, but, I grew up in a pretty small town in Wisconsin, and I came from a family that doesn't really have, a science background at all, or, so the idea that I would do academia was about as far from my mindset as I ever would have thought. The town I grew up in, at the time I grew up there, it was kind of on the edge of what you would call the Milwaukee metropolitan area. Most of the people in my town worked in the local lawnmower factory, which has since closed and moved on, as many such things happen to towns in the Midwest. Some people commuted to Milwaukee. There was still some farming that went on, but the high school I went to a public high school. I felt like I had a very good education, but it was certainly not the education that you associate in modern, what you might have expected as a fancy education, right? It's funny. I talk to my daughters about this now. I have a high school daughter who, she's taking AP classes and stuff like that, and was taking the AP test this year, and she's all worried about it. And I told her, I'm like, well, I only took one AP exam and I got a 1 on it, which was terrible. And part of it because they didn't offer AP classes at my high school, and the AP exam I took was sort of just on the side. I was woefully underprepared for it. And I think it really points out, these things, education and even preparation for some of these things that often we take for granted are really, appreciated sometimes, or they're taken for granted by those who do them. And they just assume, if we offer more AP classes, now everyone will do well. Or if we open, and I can just tell from personal experience that was not necessarily the case. I ended up being salutatorian of my high school, and I got a 1 on the only AP test I took. And I wasn't a bad student. I just was really unprepared for the test. Anyway, I just say that as a bit of background, because the high school where I went to, about half of the people went to college, most did not. And in the end, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew I liked science. I knew I liked lots of things, right? I sort of viewed education would be a great way for me to, I was excited to go to college, explore something different, kind of, interact with the world in a different way, because I know I had this very small town perspective on things. And so when I thought about going to college, I ended up, this was, the 1980s when I was making these decisions. And so the internet was not something that was a thing yet. It existed, but not in my world. And, so as cards got sent to you in the mail about how to apply for college. And so I ended up applying. I remember I got a card from Yale. I applied to Yale, did not get in. And ended up at University of Chicago, partially because they admitted me and I wanted to do something different, and I thought it would be a very different thing, move to the south side of Chicago, go to what is, at least had a reputation of being a really good school, although I had no idea what that would be like, and ended up there. And I think that really sort of set me on a path that kind of helped shape what I am today. When I was at University of Chicago, so I didn't come from a family that had a ton of money by any means. In fact, I, paid off my college loans after I got tenure at MIT. So I had a bunch of loans. I had a work-study job, and I decided with a work-study job, rather than check IDs at the gym, maybe a better thing for me to do would be, maybe I'll try to get involved in some kind of research, right? So I ended up taking a job as a dishwasher in a lab. And I really owe a lot to sort of my career development to the grad students and postdocs in that lab. Because I was hired as a dishwasher, and my PI, even years into it, still was upset if I wasn't washing dishes, and there was the grad students and postdocs who were sneaking me experiments and stuff like that to do. Ultimately, I ended up doing an honors thesis and realized I sort of liked research, and it was really that got me interested in the idea of an MD PhD degree. Really, part of why I thought I wanted to do medicine is that from the background I was coming from, the idea, if you're interested in science, the sort of careers open to you, academia was not one of them, but medicine was, and it's sort of maybe I can be a doctor. That's a respectable career. It's a way to do science or incorporate science into your life. And so that's how I got off on a pre-med track, I guess. So while I was in college, I ended up applying. University of Chicago had a program where to not be a pre-med or to get away from the negative parts of being a pre-med, they had an early admissions thing that was non-binding, and so I decided to apply for that. And I wrote in there a lot about this, maybe I would explore research more because I was starting to really enjoy this, dishwashing but doing lab on the side job. And I was lucky enough to get into that. I have to say my grades were good in college, but they were not ideal. A part of it was I felt very much a fish out of water initially because there was the, New England prep school people and me from public high school in small town Wisconsin. But then I figured out most of them were just making it up anyway. And, once I figured that out, made it easier. But I got into that. So then when I finished college, I sort of had an option to go to University of Chicago for med school. So that was great. I knew I liked working in the lab a little bit, or at least I thought I did. And so then I had this idea, maybe I could do some kind of translational research. And so with the idea of doing some kind of translational research, someone told me about MD PhD programs, so I decided to apply to some MD PhD programs. And honestly, I wanted to leave Chicago more for the experience of seeing another place. I applied to a bunch of medical schools, got interviews at only one other medical school, not for MD PhD, for straight medical school, did not get in. And so I ended up staying at University of Chicago for medical school, primarily because it was the only place that accepted me. And it's obviously a great school. I was very lucky to be there. And I was also felt very lucky to talk my way into the MD PhD program there, because I was going to be there anyway, and I really thought I wanted to do MD PhD. And they took a chance on me and let me do this. I know for a fact I was the last person admitted to the program because they made me take remedial biochemistry, which looking back on it is completely ridiculous, but they made me do that. And it was actually as I was going through the PhD part of that degree that I think I figured out how the world worked and sort of set me on what is now the career path. And it was, and I can talk more about that if you want, but I really told that convoluted story because you see somebody who's, running a lab at a place like MIT, you're now director of the Koch Institute, and you assume that everything worked out well along the way, and it was a straight line, and that, all these opportunities were just there, and it wasn't that at all. It was really many twists and turns, including being rejected basically to most of what people would call the elite colleges I applied to. And University of Chicago is an elite college, I'm not saying that, but I went there because it was the one I got into, right? And same thing with medical school. I went to the one medical school that was offered to me. The lab jobs I had, I made the most of these opportunities, but it was not it was a work-study job, and it was, I actually fought with my PI because she wanted me washing dishes more. It was stuff like that. And so I just bring that up because, you don't often realize this, that people who are in the positions who are beyond where you are, what you see is the successful positions. Almost everyone has their own stories of the twists and turns the meandering paths that they got there. And I think it's useful to share that is certainly true for me. And in fact, I think it also defines still some of my perspectives and personalities on things, right? I'm sort of never been one who was, Boston has a reputation of having this sort of snobby feel to it, and I've always been the opposite of Boston snobbery in terms of at least my things. I really believe smart people and great things can be done anywhere, and we are lucky being in a place like Boston, right? We have amazing people here. Absolutely. But there's amazing people everywhere, and I think we need to bear that in mind, and we have to always guard against sometimes what I think is the negative of the Boston snobbery, which is that, oh, well, you're just lucky to be here because this is the best place. We're not necessarily the best place unless we work to be the best place, and that means really what this is about, I think what we're going to talk about, but that means really recognizing that great talent can come from everywhere. And in fact, it is the differences and the different perspectives that really, those things coming together is really what adds strength to a place.
And thank you for sharing your life's twists and turns, so to speak. And that actually answered part of my other question for all the young people in the audience who may be watching this, who may not even have a clear idea. Like you mentioned early on in your high school career, you don't have a clear idea of where you would be ending up. This is extremely useful to know from someone who has reached that high point in life. So thank you for sharing that.
Of course,
and
yeah.
Along those lines, maybe also be useful to touch upon quickly in your career path. Could you perhaps describe one or two persons who you looked up to as a mentor? Because we all struggle with our own challenges, so having someone to perhaps talk to or...
Yeah. No, and so I've been lucky and I've had many mentors over the years, and I also it became very clear to me as I passed through my career that mentors come in different ways, and I've used, makes it sound like it wasn't back and forth, but I used mentors in different ways, right? There were people, but I can definitely touch on some of the people who were super important at just places in my life. I mean, I was very lucky. I think my parents were always very supportive of me. I mean, they are not science people. I'm still not sure they even fully know what my job is. But I think the fact that they always sort of were encouraging to let me do what I wanted to do, follow what I wanted to do, I think that was always very important, and I remained close to them in that regard. As I was going through, I already mentioned, I think it was really critical, some of the, a couple grad students and postdocs who, particularly a guy by the name of Scott Bayerson, who no one probably knows of. He has worked in industry after he left his postdoc. Another grad student, John Oblong. Like, they were really the ones in my undergraduate lab who actually took me aside and helped me learn some stuff. And I certainly wouldn't have gone anywhere without them, right? That sort of helped a lot. But I think probably one of the most formative, I think, career experiences was really my graduate school experience. And I had a number of mentors there. So, I mean, my PhD advisor was Craig Thompson, who now is, well known at Memorial Sloan Kettering. He was relatively junior at the time when I worked in his lab. I mean, he was director of a small center. That's how he came to University of Chicago, where I worked with him. But, I think I really owe it to Craig that he really taught me how to do science. But, I think Craig really helped me. A lot of the lessons I learned from Craig, even though sometimes they were hard to learn, I think have been ones that were really important that have stuck with me. And I have to say, I still reach out to Craig even sometimes now. So that was really important. But there were other mentors who I had in grad school as well, who were, sort of my peer mentors. Andy Min was someone who I worked with in the lab. Andy Min is now professor at Penn, so people may know of him. But, we were contemporaries in graduate school. I think Andy had a lot of influence as I thought about things going through grad school. Nav Chandel was really my peer at the time, but I think working with Nav, I learned a lot from him. He's now at Northwestern. And I think having sort of peer mentors like those guys, as well as larger advice from people like Craig, were really formative to me. My postdoc mentor, Lou Cantley, has been fantastic. When I was there, I learned very different things from Lou than I learned from Craig. And then as I got to be a faculty member, I don't want to start listing people because there's so many people on the MIT faculty who have helped me, but I really think the important thing to realize is that assigned mentors and more senior people, the Phil Sharps and the Bob Weinbergs, who have been great for me to get advice from, they were great offering some kinds of advice, but I also turned to people who were, closer to my career stage for a lot of advice too, the Ian Cheesemans and the Mike Hemans and, And I have to say, Angelica, who passed away this past year, Angelica was always among my closest friends on the MIT faculty. David Sabatini's close to me in field, so he was, gave me a lot of advice in some areas too. And I think it's really not having one person who I can point to and say, this is the one mentor is, I think probably better, right? I sort of worked with people in different things. And that's not even before I get to the people who helped me learn how to do clinical medicine, who, but anyway, so many mentors.
What I'm hearing is you've had almost a blessing of mentorship, not only from people higher up than you, but also from your peers who helped you kind of learn along the way.
Yeah, but I want to make a very good point about this, right? And that is that I think part of the blessing of having so many mentors is that I was not afraid to reach out and look for help where I needed it. And I think that's really important. I think it's important to realize that, I at no point had an expectation that any of these people owed me anything. It was more, I realized I needed advice. These were people who either had more experience than me or were facing similar challenges, and I reached out to them to try to get their advice. But I also have to realize that it's a two-way street, right? Like, the mentorship worked because I was willing to invest time in learning from different people, and also not expecting from them things that were not something that they maybe wouldn't be able to give. And so, and I only bring this up because it's often discussed, and good mentorship is important, and I think all of us really need to approach life with the standpoint that, we got to where we are, whoever we are, because of our experiences and because people helped us along the way. No one is successful on their own. Everyone needs help and needs to learn from things, because every time you do something new, you have to figure out something new, and anytime you can get advice from those people is important. But you can't expect that advice will necessarily be given to you freely. Perhaps it should be, but I think you got to know you have to work to go get the help where you need it. But at the same time, when you're in a position that you can provide help to people, you also need to be receptive of that too. And I think realizing that this is a two-way street, and you have to work at it both as the mentor and the mentee, ends up being super important.
Thank you for highlighting that point, and especially for the younger audience who may be watching this, you brought up a very important point of reaching out and not like struggling alone by yourself. Yes. There may be people out there who are willing to help.
Yeah. In fact, there almost always are people who are willing to help. But if they don't know that many people who would be willing to help, they need to know that you need help in order to provide.
Yes. Thank you. So I want to leave some time to talk about diversity as the actual topic on this podcast. But before we go to the serious stuff, maybe could you share a little bit of the fun stuff, like beyond lab work, clinical work? You have a lot going on your plate, administrative work. What are your hobbies, maybe, so we can get to know you better as a person?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know, I guess work is a hobby at some level, right? I mean, I love science, right? I don't do this job. I mean, part of it is a job. Being a scientist is getting to do a job that's both a job and a hobby. But, I would say, I have two daughters, and, I have a wife, and basically my family to me is a lot of where I spend most of my free time, right? And so these are things that, as my daughters have gotten older and their interests evolve, often that has defined a lot of hobbies, right? Because it's doing stuff with them, from, coaching youth sports to being, going on hikes or trips or, playing video games with them, whatever. If I say what are the things that, I enjoy doing, I guess, I've always liked sort of, nature type stuff. So I've always enjoyed hiking. I like, on and off over the years, I've run for sort of exercise and stress relief. I like to ski. That's always been an extracurricular activity that I've always enjoyed a lot. But I guess I don't know. That hopefully answers the question. Happy to go.
And jumping in also for the audience, being next door neighbors to Matt's lab, we've also seen him interact a lot with his lab family, so to speak. Well, pre-COVID days in the past year has not been kind, but
well, I still interact with them. You just don't get to see it because it's remote.
Well, I meant the fun parts where you used to cook together and have a lot of fun stuff going on.
No, I really do. I mean, I think
I'm sure
I
you
love my lab, and I
scientifically,
really yes, right. In some ways, they're like a second family, right? And I do enjoy doing stuff with them too. And actually, you brought up something. Cooking is something I actually really do enjoy doing. It's kind of like science with low stakes that works and tastes really good sometimes.
So I guess I do need to bring some of the hard parts of the conversation on, although we may not want to touch upon this, but I guess within the US we are at a point of reckoning at this point. So talking about diversity and more specifically how it relates to the Koch Institute. Before I get to any of this, let me remind the audience that Matt has been director for about 2 months now, so I'm not expecting him to have a magic a silver bullet to fix all of the issues in one stroke. We just want to know your thoughts on these issues.
Of course.
So do you view diversity of human resource as an asset to the KI? Because I remember listening to your KI town hall maybe about a month ago, and not quoting you verbatim here, but you mentioned something like diversity is at the root of our creativity and innovation here. And then along those lines, perhaps you could share what is your vision of improving the diversity in the KI over the next maybe 5 years or so.
Sure, yeah. So look, I appreciate these are hard topics, but they're really important topics, and they're topics that I've cared about for a long time. I'll go back to what I said earlier, right? I mean, look, what is our mission at the KI? Well, we want to cure cancer, but what is the mission of academia, right? The mission of academia is we create new knowledge. Our job is to be creative. And we are better off being creative if we're not focused on the ideas of a single person or group of people. And so the more we can bring different perspectives, the more we can be creative, and also we address the problems that are most important to everyone in society. And so when I say diversity is at the root of what we do, I really mean it. It's because, look, we want to end human suffering writ large, and that means all human suffering, not the suffering of a specific group of people. And the more we have different perspectives on that, the better we are at our jobs. Plus, people bring different perspectives, bring different views on a problem, and people who bring different views on a problem, it just enhances creativity. And so, look, I know we are not as diverse as we should be. That's been painfully obvious for a very long time, okay? And I also know that it's a problem that many people have talked about for some time. And I think the point of reckoning that sort of you alluded to that's come up over this last year.
Past summer
the past summer. I mean, look, it's long overdue, right? The issues that society as a whole, not forget the KI, the society as a whole of reckoning with. I mean,
maybe the past 300-400 years.
Exactly, or longer, maybe all of human history. I don't know, right? But certainly these things are deeply rooted in things that are not new, okay? Those need to be affected at a societal level, and I think we need to do our part at the local level, just as everyone needs to do their part at the local level, because systemic problems first of all, look, no one person has the power to solve systemic problems, okay? But we collectively all have to work together to fix, or the systemic problems don't get solved. And I certainly appreciate that a responsibility has been put on me to make sure that Koch Institute does its part, that we are part of the solution, even if we can't fix all the problems that exist in the world. And so, you asked what is my plan for the next 5 years. Well, my plan for the next 5 years is to do what we can to fix the problems that we can fix, right? And we, as well as the rest of the world, needs to be more diverse, okay? So let me tell you my perspective on that for what I think it is, and what are the solutions we need to do. And that is, we have to address the real problems and not do things that make us look better, okay?
So that is one of the concerns. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but one of the concerns that most people face in this conversation is just diversity theater, so to speak, and there are not enough real changes being brought about.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say something controversial here, or slightly controversial, because it's something I really believe strongly in, and that is that, one of the easiest ways to fix diversity locally is to go out and say, well, we're missing certain groups, let's go out and find those people and hire them here.
Affirmative action hires.
Well, yes, I'm going to separate this. I'm going to say, look, we're missing a certain group of people. Let's look for where they are in other universities and let's bring those here. Let's recruit them here. Look, that can address things in our community, okay? But that doesn't solve the systemic problems, right? Saying we've done better because we've gone out and looked for the right demographic group and brought people here does not solve the systemic problems that face society, right? And so I hope we can be part of a solution that fixes the problems that exist across our industry, not just makes us look better, right? Because one gets to the root cause of the problem. The other one, it's cosmetic, right? It is, as your words, diversity theater, right? And look, if there's an opportunity to hire the right people to get them here, even if they're at other institutions because they want to be here, and it adds to our diversity, that's good for our community for all the reasons that I said before. The more perspectives we have here, the better our job is going to be. So I'm not opposed to that, but I don't view that as the solution. And I don't view that as the solution because, great, now I made another place less diverse and us more. That doesn't solve the long-term problem. Unfortunately, there's no easy fixes to the long-term problem, but we're at MIT. We can't shy away from things because they're hard. And look, I'm open to suggestions. I'm open to what are the best ways to do this. And believe me, we are working on this. First of all, we have to identify what are the reasons why we are not as diverse as we should be. And I think number one is that we need to start with, well, let's make sure people are comfortable when they come here. Because one thing that I've learned in the last year from many of the conversations that have at long last bubbled to the surface is that the first way to, no one is going to do well unless they're in an environment where they feel safe and included. And that is something we can absolutely change today, and I hope we do change today. That is, we have to be a place that we cannot tolerate behavior that does not make everyone feel safe and included. And that's an easy fix. Well, maybe it's not an easy fix. It requires work, but that is something that we can absolutely do. Start inwards. And I'm really excited that those efforts are underway. And I certainly hope we can look back 5 years from now and say that, well, we at least got that part right.
So I want to push you a little bit on the solutions aspect, because like you said, this is not an easy problem. It has no easy fixes, otherwise it would have been solved by now. So there were a couple of articles, and for the audience I'll link those down in Science magazine. One was concrete steps to diversify the scientific workforce by a group of professors, and the other by our very own Sangeeta Bhatia, Susan Hockfield, and Nancy Hopkins, about diversity of women
in entrepreneurship.
Women in entrepreneurship. So, well, the first article, they had some concrete steps, and I'd like to get your thoughts on how practical those are. So they mentioned things like maybe having a coordinated federal program for improving diversity, or reshaping institutional culture to welcome underrepresented minorities, or even tailoring the grant funding policies for underrepresented groups. Perhaps you could share your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, those are all good things to do, and I don't disagree with them. I worry if that's really, look, there's only so many levers one can pull at the policy level, and they often relate to things like funding, and I think that's why those are there, and I think those make sense. But those are not going to be, unfortunately, I think, the only ways to solve this, right? I think it needs to be, people want to be in places where they feel like they're not the only one of that, right? And I think this is it's challenging. I think we need to be, I guess, proactively be looking for ways that we can increase people who bring different perspectives in, who have different experiences, and I guess start at the level of every candidate who comes through needs to be viewed for their own individual strengths and weaknesses, and make sure we are always hiring the right people. And I think where some of the solutions that were proposed in that article can help is that it can basically create constructs that makes it easier to support the people who are the right people to be in those jobs, right?
So maybe not the be-all, end-all of the solution, but part of the solution.
But I think those are great parts of the solution. But I think we need to be more proactive in our evaluation and our hiring practices. And, there are, also it starts with, we need to look at, and I think this is something that is better. Our graduate student pipeline is not perfect. But when we look at graduate students, I think our graduate student community is more diverse than our postdoc community, which is certainly more diverse than our faculty.
This was reflected in the science article that we just talked about.
Yes, and I think we need to look hard at why we're
the funnel keeps
where the funnel, as for instance, women have been a major part of the trainee cohort for some times, and it is not well reflected on the faculty. So we need to look hard at why that is, and make sure we are not doing something systemically as an institution that is causing that, right? Look, these are not things that will be solved overnight, but if we don't actively look to try to solve them, they're never going to be solved, right?
Yeah. So, and that's why I meant, I don't expect you to have a silver bullet for all the answers, but
you should, maybe not on a month time scale, but I should be held accountable, certainly on a year time scale, and I hope that, look, I don't know how long I'll be doing this job, but if, I hope when it's, when the reins someday are turned over to someone else, I can look back and say that we are in a better place than we are today. And if we're not, then I should be held accountable for that. And I need to help find a way to solve what can be solved.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those thoughts on this very important topic, and that's final segue to our last segment. And because you mentioned being a leader also comes with the responsibility of being held accountable, so I'd like to talk quickly about leadership. As a leader, what efforts do you think you'd like to take to help other people climb up the food chain? Because it's not like you mentioned earlier, it's not a one-person job, right? It's an entire institute.
Yeah. I mean,
Or how do you inspire others to?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, leaders are people too, and it's just people doing their best. I can tell you what I think is important in leadership, and I think leadership is doing things for the right reason and not for the expectation that it's going to, be for me, but it's really doing things for the right reasons, right? I hope that I can inspire other people to do good, not because they're going to get some reward because they did good, but because it's the right thing to do. And I hope I can inspire others in that. And I think, mentorship really comes into this, right? We are constantly, one of the funny things about academia is you're constantly, if you do well at something, now you're asked to go do another job that you're not trained to do. And that keeps happening, right? And so I think, people need to recognize that and remember that you got help at each step of the way, and make sure you look back and help others who are trying to get to where you are, to climb the ladder. And look, there's lots and lots and lots of talent in our institute and in our community. And if people want to be involved and take on leadership roles, I want to help them do it. And, we need leaders, and leadership can mean lots of different things. And I can also tell you from experience, you can be a leader and not necessarily be put in a position where you have a title that says you're a leader. I think real leadership is doing the right thing, again, even if it's not
for the glamour.
If it's not for the glamour of it, it's doing the right thing because it's doing the right thing. And I think, I talk to people in my lab about this when their papers get rejected and what's wrong with the publishing process. And I tell them, well, here's what's wrong with the publishing process. Leadership is not doing to others it's doing what we can to fix what's wrong with the publishing process. Not necessarily being, well, this happened to my paper, so I'm going to go do this to other people's papers, right? That is not leadership. Leadership is saying, well, this is a problem. Now I need to go to not have that problem. We need to do things differently. And so we're going to do things differently because if we don't, otherwise we're just propagating the exact same problem we did before.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And I think that applies not just to the academic or publishing industry, but also to our
it applies to absolutely everything. I mean, I brought that up as an example, but you're absolutely right. And that's, what I'm saying. Look, we know we have a problem. Some solutions have been tried that don't work. So let's try other ones. If those don't work, at least we can say we tried something different, right? So
with that, I'd like to be mindful of your time. I should have said this earlier, but congratulations on being named the new director of the KI, succeeding Professor Tyler Jacks. And thank you for sharing your valuable inputs with us today and with the audience as well. And hopefully we can look back in a few years' time and reflect on this again.
Yeah, no, that would be wonderful. And, thank you again for doing this important podcast and for furthering the discussion of what really is, I know, a topic that's important to many people in our community and is super important if we want to move forward as a society. So Thank you, Nick.
And thank you to our audience. I'll talk to you in the next video. Bye-bye.